My name is Dr. John Salerno. Some of you know me. I have a practice in New York City, and this is my satellite office that we pretty much just opened up. And tonight we're going to talk about something that I think is really very apropos, both for this community, for most of our communities, for the way the environment is headed. And it's just an essential part of a medical workup, we think. So everyone really should be tested for heavy metals. And I'll get into some of the anecdotes and stories that we've seen through the years, but we pretty much, both here and in New York, test everyone for heavy metals, and I'll explain why in detail in just a bit. But basically, we'll talk about toxic and essential elements. One of the things that we do when we look at toxic heavy metals, we also look at essential elements because heavy metals, the toxic metals, tend to deplete our sources of essential elements. Things like lead will deplete stores of zinc, for example. So a lot of that has to be checked. We either do with doctor's data, which is this test, or we do simple blood tests so that we can determine what patients are truly deficient in. So these are important terminologies that we use just to get into some important, the most detailed ones. Environmental exposure pretty much speaks for itself. That's what we're exposed to on an everyday basis. So we're breathing things in, we're eating toxic metals, we have toxic metal exposure with products that we put on our skin, believe it or not. And then what substances that are found in the environment that are foreign to us are called xenobiotics. And this is the most important term for tonight, something called net retention. That's really what we want to measure. And I'll get into it in a bit with the rest of the slides, but we want to see exactly what's stored in our body tissues of heavy metals. We also want to see what we may be acutely toxic or exposed to. And there's ways to differentiate, so the future slides will show that. We'll get into some detail. So we're exposed. The process of getting the metals into our bodies assimilates, meaning our body will actually take it in and then will try its very best to get rid of these toxic metals. So whether it be mercury in the form of fish that we eat, whether it be lead in our drinking water, the body is pretty efficient, at least initially, in detoxing that. Over time, however, there's a retention phase, so we would call our bodies reach a critical mass, and it's very different for everyone else. And this is generally where we start seeing symptoms when we retain these heavy metals. So what we do, so that we can understand exactly why some people have great manifestations with a relatively mild amount of heavy metals, and vice versa, some people have really no symptoms. We look at something, a gene called MTHFR. Have any of you guys heard of MTHFR? So we look at that because it will determine whether you're genetically predisposed to retaining these heavy metals and other toxins for that matter, or whether you're not. So that's an important workup for us, what we do here in New York. So these terms, toxicity or toxic effects, so toxicity really talks to you, I'm sorry, can you see me? Okay. Toxicity really talks about acute poisoning. So when we do blood tests, or we can do a hair analysis, we can actually determine whether they're toxic to the point of having recent exposure, between 60 and 90 days or so. Toxic effects is what we measure, and that's what we're measuring that's retained in the body tissues over time. And in fact, when we do these challenge tests, which I'll show you in a bit, we can actually determine how much heavy metal is in your body since you were born, essentially. So important distinctions, and we do both. We'll check for acute toxicity, and we will check for exposure over the length of time. Environmental exposure, so we look at things, of course, like mercury that's in fish, we look at lead that's in water, cadmium from cigarette smoke. We're exposed pretty much on a daily basis, and if the levels are low enough and we're genetically fine and we keep our bodies in pretty good shape, these metals generally don't accumulate. Interestingly, a lot of our athletes, pro athletes particularly, but those that really exercise and sweat, have very low levels generally over time of heavy metals because they're sweating out toxic metals, and we've seen that over and over again. So one caveat that you can take from this conference is that the more you sweat, the more you're detoxing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a vigorous exercise, but we recommend like infrared saunas, for example, ways to detox. So important to keep that in mind, that the body does have numerous ways, and there are ways we can do this without essentially intravenous or other therapeutic measures until it really reaches a critical mass. You can go to the next slide. So this is really where we pay a lot of attention to. This is net retention, meaning this is what we're exposed to and what's stored in our bodies, because the bodies over time can't get rid of the onset of accumulation over a lifetime. So if you're eating a lot of tuna fish, if you're eating a lot of swordfish, very high in mercury, and you're doing it continually, no matter what you do, over time it's going to accumulate in your bodies. Just an interesting story with Tony Robbins, and I can mention it because he mentions it, but he was our patient in New York. He'll come in for IVs, and actually Fear and I were with him. He called us over to do an IV at the Four Seasons Hotel. So to make a long story short, we were sitting with him. I said, Tony, what do you eat typically for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? He said, well, for breakfast I have tuna salad, for lunch I have a swordfish steak, and for dinner a tuna steak. I said, Tony, how long have you been doing that for? I said, you're giving everyone all this great advice. Who gave you that advice? He said, oh, my personal trainer. I've been doing it for years. And he said, why? I said, those fish have the highest levels of mercury. So anyway, I said, do my blood test. Just do whatever you can. Let's test it. Anyway, make another long story short, I used to test my wife and my assistant. So we tested all three. About 2 days later, normally it takes about a week, I get an urgent call from the lab that there's a critical mercury level that you need to address on a patient. So a typically high level in the blood is maybe 20, maybe 30, and you're getting really up there with mercury. Tony's level was about 146, which was basically mercury poisoning. Not basically, it was. If that wasn't addressed then, he would have been dead in maybe a month or so. It was extreme, and from eating fish continually, those type of fish over time. His wife was in bad shape too, and his assistant, but not like him. And he really was looking sick. His body was sweating routinely. I don't know if anyone had been to any of the seminars, but his body was always sweating because of the body was trying to get rid of, through sweat, the extreme levels of mercury. So again, there are fish that you have to avoid. We're actually recommending to probably not eat much fish more than once, and even of the good fish, no more than once every 2 weeks, unfortunately, because we're seeing even the smaller fish like salmon becoming contaminated with mercury. So these are availability of tests and pricing, but we don't need that. You can go to the next. I just want to run through some of these tests that can be done here in Connecticut, not in New York. New York does not allow hair analysis, but there are some advantages. Hair analysis is a quick test for heavy metals and essential elements. It will also go back about 90 days at most. You can turn the page. And basically, it's a quick test for really acute toxicity. So we could do that here in Connecticut. Again, it does not tell us what's retained in our body tissues. Again, that's a big differential. Go to the next one. So, same thing with blood. We can do a blood test, and we do. Blood is considered the gold standard. So if you go to a traditional doctor here in Connecticut or New York, and your blood tests negative for lead, mercury, cadmium, they'll say there's nothing wrong with you, that there's no toxicity. However, that only tells us acute poisoning because the body is very efficient at getting it out of the bloodstream. So because your lead tests negatively with a blood test really means nothing, particularly to us, because the retention test, you can go through this slide, is the most important. Again, another test that's more for acute poisoning of heavy metals, and red blood cell, the same thing. Interestingly, you go back to the implant metals. By the way, does anyone have or any prosthesis or implants from hip surgery or knee or anyway? We test that routinely because there are toxic effects of the metals that are implanted into our patients from surgical procedures. And when we see these levels and we see a lot of symptoms related to it, these patients have to not only get their prosthesis or implants taken out, they also have to detox. So These are important tests, something we can do typically here in Connecticut. I don't think this test is licensed yet in New York.
Yes.
I have a question.
Yes.
Oh, yes, sir.
Would you consider a clip that you put in one's breast to locate a specific cyst? I have a clip in my breast that was inserted years ago, and things are coming to me right now since I've had that.
Do you know what the clip was made of, or do we have any idea?
I think it's metal of some sort because it shows up on it shows up on mammogram. I know, so.
Oh, it's a metal. Yeah, then that's significant. And this is a good test. The test that we just had up on the board is a good test for you actually, because we can test for them in cobalt, chromium. I have a patient now that's having her implants removed from hip surgery and tested high across the board and was having connective tissue issues, autoimmune, generalized arthritis, and joint deformities everywhere since the implants. Very important to at least get an idea of what's in there. This test could tell you what may be leaking. You're welcome. Fecal, same thing. We can go back maybe 90 days or so. This is a test I generally don't do much of for heavy metals since we have better tests available. The urine heavy metal test though that we do that's routine in my office here and in New York is the urine, what we call the urine challenge test. And this is the important test because again, this test goes back a lifetime of exposure to heavy metals. So you can go to the next one. So this is basically how it's collected. What we generally do is we will inject a chelating agent. A chelating agent is an agent made of amino acids that bind with heavy metals and excrete it out the urine. So they'll get an IV of the chelating agent, and then they'll get either another IV of another chelating agent or an oral version of that chelating agent, and then we ask our patients to collect the urine over 6 hours. Next. This measures essential elements. Again, we don't do much of that, but go to the next one. This is a typical report that we would get for that challenge test, which is called the urine toxic metal test, the one I just discussed. So like this patient, again, we like to try to keep all our metals after what we call provocation in the green zone. And as you see, this patient has extreme levels of lead, some moderate levels of other heavy metals, and combine that with symptoms of our patients, we would start a chelating process. Sometimes we'll do oral. Most of the time when levels are in the pink zone and the high level zones, we'll do IVs. And we'll start a plan typically of 10 IV interventions and then repeat the same test, which is the challenge test again after 10 treatments to see how metals are going down. Since there's no mercury involved with this patient, we probably would only use one chelating agent. Most of our patients test very high for other metals, particularly mercury. One thing to keep in mind, these are all very synergistic, so it's not 1 + 1 + 1 is 3. It's like 1 + 1 + 1 is 23. They affect each other. The clearance of one affects the clearance of another. So, you know, to keep that in mind, this patient would still be rather toxic, even though some of these are in the moderate range at very best. So this is the provocation test that I was telling you about. So you can do a urine test without provocation. That would tell you recent exposure potentially. And then you use the provocation, and these are the agents we use. And we draw out the heavy metals. And again, it draws it out of fat cells. It draws out of tissues of our bodies. So where are these metals in our bodies? They're typically in the central nervous system, in the brain, in the heart, lungs. They affect every organ system. Most of these heavy metals affect the endocrine system, hormones, thyroid, progesterone, estrogen, testosterone. They also cause autoimmunity. They, of course, cause issues with memory loss. And what we want to know is, number one, what metals you actually have by the provocation test. And then we design a course of chelating agents based on what levels show up in the testing. This is basically how it's done, and we go past that. just want to get to the slides that describe some of the effects, or we can discuss where things come from. I just want to go over a couple of really interesting points, and people may not be aware. How many people actually eat kale here? Okay. Fortunately, I do too, until I learned and saw that there's a lot of something called thallium in kale. Has anyone heard that?
No.
Yeah. So again, it reaches a critical mass. Patients that eat kale will show up with thallium, sometimes at very high levels and sometimes asymptomatic. But thallium is carcinogenic. It affects bone growth. It affects hormone systems. It affects central nervous system. Thallium is also used in contrast mediums. For example, when you're going for a thallium stress test, when you're checking your heart. So these issues, clearly have to be looked at and addressed. You know the story with Chuck Norris? Does anyone know that story? No one? So do you know what agent they use when they do MRIs, what they inject you? Who's had MRIs with contrast here? Just a few people? Okay. Anyway, they use a contrast material called gadolinium. And patients are told that it's given with a chelating agent so it doesn't accumulate in your body tissues. But guess what? That's not correct. It accumulates. And if you read the story of Chuck Norris's wife, she got extremely ill from gadolinium from doing 2 or 3 MRIs, ironically, for symptoms that the gadolinium was actually causing rather than anything else. And she was poisoned. They're actually suing the manufacturers now of gadolinium. I had a cardiologist from Long Island that came to my office who was also deadly ill, could not practice, extreme muscle weakness, fatigue. He had done 6 or 7 contrast MRIs with gadolinium, and by the time we detoxed and chelated him, he did maybe 20 or 30, and he did quite well at us, but his gadolinium was through the roof, all past the big range.
I don't know who you're talking about, the patient, cardiologist.
Yeah.
I was very skeptical because, cardiologist, and then I called him later on, he said, I never felt better. Can't you check on me? Because he came how people come and completely different person.
Yeah, and it's just becoming more recognized that a lot of these things that they put in our bodies to diagnose, and oftentimes they're trying to do the right thing, but they don't realize these things accumulate. And again, some patients are more susceptible than others. It really depends on genetic variabilities, what shape you're in, age, kidney function. So it's really problematic. Anyway, he did very well, but you can read the story of Chuck Norris's wife, which is quite interesting also.
You know who we have also got? The young guy who's 28. He did 7 CT scans. You know
Right.
what I'm talking about? And
Yeah.
then his entire system shut down.
Yeah, we see just a lot of it in New York, unfortunately. It's just too much.
Yeah.
And I'll go through this pretty quickly, but you know where lead is most common? Does anyone know? Right, mostly drinking water. And this is apropos for, unfortunately, our nice, beautiful town of Fairfield, but there's a town landfill, and I don't know if you know the story, but the town is suing this company that was taking landfill and filling our lovely baseball fields and parks with contaminants of arsenic and lead. And we're actually seeing a lot of issues, particularly with lead in patients here in Connecticut already, because of the exposure to the landfill. But lead, of course, they'll tell you in kids it causes ADHD and learning disabilities, but in adults, it does the same thing. It also causes fatigue, it affects our hormone function. It's very important, and it's a very common heavy metal, very common to be toxic with it. Another area that you need to pay attention to, any homes before 1978 has lead paint. So even if you've redone the home or repainted over, there's a lot of aerosolization in the lead and or in dust that you still may be breathing in. And there are companies you can call that can test your home if you test high in lead. So an important source, we see a lot of that, unfortunately. Mercury from fillings and from certainly from fish. You know the story, the Mad as a Hatter was a term that was developed back, I guess in the early 1900s, but it referred to having a factory that was making hats in France, and these poor women were using mercury to smooth the felt of the hat, and they all became insane, unfortunately. And they didn't know at the time what was going on. They figured out years later, but they were mercury poisoned, and they literally became insane from the extreme toxic exposure. So mercury is a central nervous system severe toxin. It causes anxiety, depression, heart palpitations. It has been implicated in things like Parkinson's, ALS, for sure, any other neurological, even MS. We see a lot of mercury. So it's unfortunate because the fish that's normally we think is healthy for us is contaminated with mercury. It becomes a big issue because again, it will accumulate. You can go to the next, just move that up. Oh no, just move it up, yeah. Is there any others? Move it down maybe. And the other two that are of interest, arsenic. Do you know where arsenic is detected in pretty regularly? In foods? What's that?
Rice.
Right. So we see a lot of patients, typically from like South America or the islands, that have a lot of arsenic in their system. Also from wines, particularly wines that are not organic, we'll see a lot of arsenic, unfortunately. So again, arsenic causes issues with extreme fatigue. It affects hormone function. It's a central nervous system depressant, meaning it'll cause symptoms related to other neurological conditions like we just mentioned, Parkinson, ALS. And again, we detox arsenic with chelating agents like calcium EDTA, and we use something called DMSA for that. Last, and I'll just go over this, cadmium, do you know where cadmium is most obtained from? Okay.
Cigarettes.
Oh, she said, yeah, right. Cigarette smoke. So a lot of patients will have smoked maybe a year or two in their 20s, and all of a sudden, we do a challenge test and cadmium's elevated. Yeah, we'll pick it up, we won't mask that. But cadmium is extremely carcinogenic. It's the main reason why cigarette smokers are much more susceptible to cancer. Easy to chelate out, but the longer it stays in your body, the more problematic that is. I wanted to introduce you. Is Patricia still here? Oh, there you are. Okay, good. I wanted to introduce you to a very dear patient of mine that wanted to, and she's so proud to do that, tell her story. And Patricia, you want to come up and Patricia, I had the pleasure to meet here in Connecticut, and she'll go over her issues in a story, which is pretty fascinating. Thanks, Patricia. Yeah, oh, do you need light?
Yeah.
Yeah, please go over there, thank you.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to be here at the Heavy Metal Toxicity event to share my story. My name is Patricia Mazzola, and I am a Fairfield resident and patient of Dr. Salerno's for only 4 months. In that short time, I have experienced remarkable health improvement thanks to him and his staff and the IV heavy metal detoxification. The protocol has been life-changing, as when I first came to see him, my symptoms were lengthy, severe, and serious. I was homebound and sometimes bedbound. Dr. Salerno diagnosed me with mercury poisoning, and the rest, as they say, is history. After being progressively sicker for 10 years, and seeing many, many doctors, from local ones to multiple Yale specialists to leading New York City research specialists, my diagnosis of myalgic encephalomyelitis, ME, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome, worsened with each passing year. The list of doctors I sought answers and help from includes 3 general practitioners, 3 allergists, also immunologists, 3 neurologists, 3 pulmonologists, a cardiologist, a neuromuscular specialist, and a homeopath. I endured a hospitalization where nothing wrong could be found, yet my health continued to deteriorate. I first heard about Dr. Salerno earlier this year, but at the time was being treated by a renowned ME/CFS specialist and wanted to give the prescribed treatment the opportunity to work. At the time when my symptoms were again worsening, I read the article in Fairfield magazine that some of you may be familiar with about Dr. Salerno and his practice opening a location here in Fairfield. I made an appointment, and that has been a life-changing decision. At my initial appointment, I could barely walk down the hallway to his office, so from the door to here. Exertion, the inability to stand for more than a minute, and needing to constantly drink water were weighing on my mind. My voice and speech were impaired. My brain felt like it was in a fog, and it had recently started feeling like it was on fire when I would communicate. My hands and feet felt pins and needles. My muscles were wasting, most notably in my arms and legs. Dr. Salerno listened closely, and I didn't feel judged, as was often the case at an initial consultation. He suggested having testing done. The results showed high levels of multiple metals, with a mercury level so high that he diagnosed it as mercury poisoning. All my symptoms aligned with the diagnosis, and yet this was the first time any doctor had tested for it. Dr. Salerno recommended starting an IV detoxification that day, which I did. I was extremely surprised that after the first treatment, the hallmark symptom of ME/CFS, which is post-exertional malaise, was gone. PEM is the crushing feeling of exhaustion after any exertion. In my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined that to occur. Typically, it takes days or longer to recover from an activity, but that symptom resolved and continues to be maintained. I continued the treatments for these more than 3 months since, at times with setbacks, but I am on a positive trajectory and continue to experience improvements. I have been able to speak, stand, walk, leave the house, and take care of myself daily. My journey continues as I still have more mercury to be detoxed, and my energy level remains moderate, though vastly improved from when I first walked into this office. I remain optimistic and hopeful to obtain a quality of life where I can return to a normal schedule and work, play, and enjoy life as I once did. I also remain hopeful for my son, who is also similarly being treated by Dr. Salerno, to return to his normal schedule of work, play, and enjoying life. As the holiday season approaches, I am now excited to be with my family and friends to celebrate in a much different capacity than in recent years. Thank you, Dr. Salerno, staff, and guests, and I hope my story has left you inspired.
My name is Fiona. I worked with Dr. Salerno 5 years. Prior to coming to Dr. Salerno, I completely have no idea what is holistic. For me, it was like completely new language. When I came, like second and third day, I realized, and I said, Dr. Salerno, you remember? I said, this is future medicine. I had a feeling that this was gonna happen. But I was a little, at the beginning I saw people doing the metal, like now TRH, blah blah, and I was skeptical and I was scared to do it on me. You know, when you do it on somebody else, it's kind of like, you know, you do it on somebody else, and you like, when you're nervous and you know the thing, what's gonna happen, you kind of, oh, wait a minute. So one time I said, you know what, I'm doing heavy metal and I don't care what's gonna, you know, I just want to see what's happening in me. I have 9 macro feelings. I had thyroid cancer 4 years ago, so it just completely took it out. I took my 9 macro feelings, I did heavy metal, and my macro was high, 25, it's really high for my age, and the lead was high. And I started to do chelation. I'm telling you, I felt like brain fog is gone. Like that, so calm, so relaxed, so things like, and I started to do it twice a week. So for me, for my body, it was completely at the beginning, it was too much. So I made it slowly. I did like around 10 IVs. I gave myself a breakup. But it's completely what is before and after, and I still have to do some other things. I ate a lot of tuna fish. Like I was craving so much sushi tuna. Like I was eating it every weekend. And I couldn't understand, I had a brain fog before, but I couldn't understand why I had it worse, especially when my young age. And I used to work in a hospital and I couldn't focus, and you know what is happening. But it's definitely, when I did chelation on me, the feeling that your body is detoxing and pulling everything out, you actually feel this because it's, you feel more like the brain fog is gone, you have more focus. So also I can tell you about experiences mine with other patients. So we have so many people coming in. I have a patient that he came very skeptical, you know, 40 years, he came, he was mean, he was not so nice, and he came with us like, I'm coming, I don't feel well, I have no focus. Kind of skeptical at the beginning, like I told him medicine, like what it is, he had no clue. Let me tell you, he did 20 chelations. He becomes so much nicer. He brought his wife, his own child, something he would never like said I would bring another doctor. And he went to cardiologist. I told him 50% of his plaque is gone. That says a lot. I have another kid, autistic child, 9 years old. Before he did the middles, he was completely IQ high. His aluminum was 1400. You know what I'm talking about? 1400 aluminum in heavy metal. Never saw such things like in my 5 years, and we had kids. Another child, 4 years old, that something, and you came to the mother, the lawyer, that the owner, you know, like when she was renting the place, something was painting and painting on lead, so the child was eating that and have brain development delay. So he came to us and eat much better compared to what he was. As a cardiologist, you said that was also very skeptical. You know, I'm talking with my patient and see what he's saying, because I didn't want to know, like, you know, he said completely like different story, what's completely is going on before and after. I have another girl, she's 28 years old. She took antibiotics, I don't know, remember which one. She had MTH also, her entire system shut down, no period. Like, you know what I'm talking about. She's completely like, doesn't understand what is going on when 28 have no period for a long time. So she did 10 IVs. The period came back before we put her on hormones. So we started to do it to see what's going on. In my 5 years experience, so many things that is absolutely out of this range. And now people come, they're scared because they go to so many doctors, and one of the doctors tells them, I'm sorry, honey, you have to take antidepressants, you're so depressed. Or one doctor very, talking to her, like, doesn't go to the root of the problem, give her 20 medication and doesn't go to the root, what is actually going on. I had a lady that she used to do colonic. It's also one of the detoxing things. So all her patients came to do just colonic. She, Tracy, she used to work with her. 4 patients just came to do Myers. They didn't come to do nothing else. They just do colonic, with Dr. Salerno. They didn't know about Dr. Salerno. I introduced them. And I started to talk, and I asked people. And first question said, what do you guys eat? I eat every day salmon. I don't eat no other thing besides salmon every day. I said, do you have brain fog? He said yes. I said, do you have focus problem? She said yes. I said, do you have problem with the cold, with the heat? She said, yes. I said, you definitely have thyroid problems and definitely heavy metal toxicity. I said, how do you know? Because I see his experience and you look very pale. And you know what I'm talking about, not gonna mention the name, she came, thyroid is off, and mercury and lead high as my level. So she did 15 to 20 chelation, and you put on thyroid medication. She brought her husband to do other things. Somebody that doesn't go to doctors. Just, we have another patient that he came, his husband and wife. So wife is kind of was skeptical, the husband was, I want to detox. I have medical things, I don't know what's happening, I'm age 40, I always was energizing. Now my testosterone is low down, nobody can give me explanation, go to the doctors. They tell me it's your age, your testosterone have to be low, that's after 40, it's like, for men, it's okay. He said, it's not okay, that's not supposed to be. So we did chelation, you know what I'm talking about, we did 10 to 20 chelations. His testosterone level went from, I don't know what, low to high, without putting him on hormones. So the things helped him to put everything have to be up. Like that's kind of thing. So when you, and one thing I tell to all my patients, you have to believe in what you do. If you believe it's gonna help you, it's definitely gonna help you. This kind of thing, you look and your body tells you something. Certain things, when I felt my brain fog, I'm like 20, 25, I used to work in surgical, and I always had to be more energy to focus certain things. And I had non-medical feelings, and I thought, what is going on? Before I actually found it here and turned to medicine, there's nobody even talk about it. And I read an article about actually CNN. If you talk about all these media things, 95% of baby food is toxic to metals. So people talk about it, but a lot of people do about it, and this kind of thing, I believe 100%. It's a future, and the more that people talk about it, the more you're gonna see what's happening. Like it pops out, it starts to pop out from all that kind of thing. And Dr. Atkins, he's the one that 4 years ago started to talk about it, and Dr. Salerno, he is the one that actually chelation and detoxing in New York. That's a lot of people came for that, for detoxing, and I see a lot of things changing from 0 to 100%.
She's converted. Patricia, thank you. Thanks for your. Thank you, guys. Do you have any questions about what we discussed? Yes.
So you talked about joint replacements. How long typically does it take for someone who's had a joint replacement and prosthesis before you start to see possibly?
Well, that's a good question. It really depends on a number of factors: age, renal function, their general health, but probably sometimes within a year, and sometimes it can be over 6 or 7 years. Whether they have that genetic defect that doesn't allow them to detox, it would happen sooner. But we see it almost routinely with most patients with prosthesis, unfortunately. It's important to measure that.
And
Yes.
medical insurance will replace this prosthesis? Do you see that
Well,
causing
we've had a few patients, yes, so far it seems that way. I'll check with them, but we have a patient going back now and having it redone, or taken out. And they're using more of an inert substance, so.
If someone's doing a hip replacement or something like that, can they request
Yes,
something safer?
definitely. What should really be done, 2 things should be done. They should check the MTHFR because they would know if they're going to retain, that's a gene, a blood test, that they would retain some of the toxic metals. They should also check whatever substance they're going to use, whether it be cobalt, whatever it may be, or chromium based. They should check for allergies to that too. And in fact, whatever they're going to use, they should be tested before the surgical procedure. And unfortunately, we're seeing in New York, no one's really doing that. And then the consequences that occur afterwards. So it should be tested prior.
Any experience with CLL?
I'm sorry?
Any experience with patients with CLL?
Yes, a lot of correlation, unfortunately, with that as a blood disease and heavy metals. So, oftentimes the culprit is environmental, including heavy metals. And again, heavy metals is one whole subject, but there are things like bisphenol A from plastic bottles, and there's a slew of other heavy metals that we could actually measure here in Connecticut that may be a cause or a contributing cause to CLL. But definitely heavy metals play a role, and it's in the literature. So when we have any cancer patients, and they'll come in for high dose vitamin C, and we'll do that routinely, but we always check them for metals. So if they have heavy metals, we'll combine the testing, the treatment with vitamin C with a chelating agent to get out the metals. Sometimes we even go one step further. We do a test to the cancer patients called the Greek test. That Greek test will tell you what nutrients are best and what nutrients don't work for that specific cancer. It's a
What is
great-
the test?
It's called the Greek test.
Greek?
Greek, like the country. We send it to Greece, and we get an idea of what nutrients, what IVs work and what don't. So we can really get specific. It works also for chemotherapeutic agents. We think everyone really should be tested that has cancer for both, for traditional and alternative. Yes.
So I had 8 chelations at another facility over a period of several months, probably like 6 months. And I didn't feel any differently, so I stopped going because I do have 3 or 4 amalgams, and so I figured I should get those taken out and then do it. What is your thought on that?
They probably use the wrong chelating agent, is my thought. We see a lot of that. So, like the calcium EDTA that's typically used for most heavy metals does not work for mercury. So, we use something called DMPS, DMSA, or alpha lipoic acid, excuse me, and another selenium. But it's not. That's probably the first thing that we see that's pretty common.
This was done by Dr. Fradlin, which I know you work with, so I would
Yeah,
think he
I
would
don't
know.
think he uses DMPS. I got to speak with him about that. And I know now it's hard to get. So it's not his fault. And if it's mercury, calcium EDTA does not work great with it. Yes, sir.
So you said that you did 10 chelation or 8 chelation within 6 months, right? Is there a matter of frequency as?
Well, that's a good question. That is an important point. So when we see a high level of metals, we like to try to do the frequency maybe twice a week, so you don't redistribute the metals from the first chelating. So if you did it like on a Monday and then did it another 3 weeks later, what you take out that day can get redistributed, and you'll end up defeating the purpose. So we try to do, particularly high levels of metals, you try to do them twice a week at least. We had a few patients from Switzerland. An interesting story. They had nickel toxicity from, believe it or not, runoff into Lake Lucerne from a factory that made watches and that used nickel. It's crazy. And she came in and did chelations every day except Saturday because we were closed for about a month and a half. She just wanted to try to get it out, and she did. So I mean, you could technically. So you could technically do it every day. We don't really have issues. Sometimes patients feel tired, and we'll give minerals because we're taking out also essential minerals with the heavy metals. So if they're not doing great, we'll have to put back minerals after the 4th or 5th treatment or so.
So just to clarify, you do recommend chelation even with amalgams?
Oh, that was your question. Are they old pills?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we generally don't pay attention to it because sometimes taking it out will stir that up more than. But the way that we determine it is we do 10 treatments. If the mercury starts going up, then they have to come out. That means they're leaking. We're pulling them out. So we don't see that often, but it can happen.
For those of us that love rice, do you know if there's rice from a certain area or a certain grain that would be better?
I think if you get like an organic-based rice, it has less arsenic. Because arsenic's in pesticides. But, it's problematic, and that's a growing concern for us, because, everyone's eating rice and not realizing that they're becoming really contaminated with arsenic. It's a shame. And of course, hail and thallium, which is another issue. The environment has just changed so much, unfortunately. Did you guys want to speak? Any other questions? I'm so sorry. We have a couple of, do you want to speak about your,
Actually, Michael's gonna speak, I'm just transferring this off and
yeah, you can
And
certainly
it's
just speak.
meeting.
But thank you guys for coming for the lecture, and we'll discuss a little thing or two of what we offer here. And